You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You may find all your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. We are pleased to announce our podcast is now a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle and me at leadersandlegends.net. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Dana Hunsinger Benbow, and she is a sports writer for the Indianapolis Star. And she's more than that. She is the premier sports journalist in this market, in the opinion of Leaders and Legends. And what she does so well is she satisfies and she feeds, and this is one of the questions I'm going to ask you later, are Hoosiers' insatiable appetite for nostalgia. So if you want to feel good about yourself, you want to feel good about Indiana, then make sure you read Dana's columns in the Indianapolis Star. Dana, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are, as I look through your biography and through the conversations we've had during the years we've known each other, a Hoosier through and through.
Yep. I was born and raised in Greenfield, Indiana, which is on the east side of Indianapolis. I got my writing start when my mom and dad gave me Willie Nelson's On the Road Again. It was like the single record, actually, the vinyl. And I was like 5 years old, and they got me a Fisher's Price record player, and I played it, and I was like, he keeps saying the same thing over and over, On the Road Again. So I actually rewrote Willie Nelson's classic when I was like 5 and tried to add other other verses in. And so, of course, my mom bragged on me. And from there, I was like, well, then I should write. And so that's how I got my writing start. And then sports wise, my dad grew up in the era of the Yankees winning in one decade, they won 9 World Series or something. And so I grew up watching Yankees with him. And then the Celtics, he loved them. On Sunday afternoons, we would watch the NBA. Dennis Johnson, Casey Jones was the coach, Kevin McHale, that team. And so, yeah, I mean, my dad just gave me my love of sports. And then, so that's kind of why I love the historical kind of sports stories. They're my very favorite.
Well, your columns, your stories are must read for those of us who, like you, I've basically spent all of my life in Indiana, except for the 3 years I was in the Army. And we love to look back. And I'm going to ask you about some of those stories. Some of them have to be fun to write, and some of them have to be tough to write.
Yeah.
But you mentioned your love of writing. What made you matriculate into journalism as opposed to another way to make your living through the written word?
I really kind of liked radio. And so my friend and I would get together after the Lakers games, with the Celtics, and we would get our cassette tape out and pretend like we were sports radio announcers when we were in elementary school. And so I always loved then it was the next day breaking news. Now it's 24-hour cycle, but I love the idea of writing something that people had to read, like a book or whatever, but breaking news or sports news, I felt like people, would that was something they had to read. And I went to Ball State and I went to Butler first and then went over to Ball State and started taking journalism classes there. And I just loved it. And my professor there was the first woman sports writer at the Star. Her name was Debbie Reed. She's still alive and I still talk to her, but I made her sound like she was in the past tense and she's not, but she was there when the Colts moved to Indy in '84 and she like covered that. And so here was this like woman who had been this legend kind of writing sports. And so, that was always my dream.
Now, Ball State is famous for producing journalists, and it's terrific journalism school. Were you at Ball State with anyone who's currently working in the Indianapolis market, or any names we would necessarily know? We like to ask these questions of people when they attend colleges, whether it's Harvard or IU or Purdue, Notre Dame.
I'm 47, so Letterman had left. Jim Davis was gone, but Garfield's creator. I'm trying to think. I can't think of anyone famous that was there when I was there. Just me, I guess, who's not famous. Except for in my mind.
Okay, but you also did you go to Greenfield Central High School? Yep,
Greenfield Central High School.
So you are at least the third Greenfield Central alum to have appeared on the podcast with joining, Michael O'Connor, former chief of staff to Bart Peterson.
Yep.
And now works at Lilly. And Dave Arland, who used to work at WIBC and was press secretary for Bill Hudnut and went and worked for Thompson / RCA, now has his own PR gig. He came on to talk about the legacy of Bill Hudnut. So you are number 3. We've had several Harvard grads actually. And so we're keeping count. We're keeping count of all the important alums. Did you go to Ball State? Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think Dr. O'Connor in Greenfield, he's my parents' doctor. I think he's brother to that O'Connor, I think, but that's neither here nor there.
Do you know Mike? I mean, do you know that you guys went to the same high school? Or Arlen? You and Dave Arlen have several of the same sort of background.
Yeah, I know of Dave Arlen for sure. I don't know O'Connor.
Poor Michael. Wait till I tell him. What made you decide to go to Butler in the first place and then switch? Did you have a career change in mind?
I played tennis. And so I got a spot on the tennis team there. And so I went there and ended up not finishing playing tennis. And my dad was helping out. I had like an academic scholarship there. And then when I decided I wasn't going to play tennis and that I didn't really want to do psychology, which is what I went into, because there wasn't really a big journalism thing there. I was like, I really want to do journalism. And he said, a state school would be a lot cheaper for me than a public or a private school. So since he was paying, I transferred over to Ball State for journalism, which of course has a great program.
We are big tennis fans here at the Leaders and Legends podcast. We actually had one of our previous guests was John Wertheim, who is is executive editor of Sports Illustrated. He's also their tennis writer and born in Bloomington. And we talked a lot about tennis when we had our interview with John. Who did you admire growing up? Tennis is such a wonderful game. I play racquetball incessantly, mostly because I was never any good at tennis. But who did you admire as a tennis player? What drove you to that game? Because I know you played volleyball as well.
Yeah. Tennis. Well, I was obsessed with Pete Sampras. Like that was, and during the whole Boris Becker, Pete Sampras, all those days. And then I loved Monica Seles, who of course grunted every time she hit the ball. My dad would always just go with me on the weekends and we go to like a high school court and just play tennis. And I just loved it. And so I didn't even start till my freshman year of high school. And I was just like, I'm going to try this. And so I just fell in love with it. And I always played singles. I never was any good at doubles. Like I could, for some reason, couldn't grasp it. But yeah. And so once I got to Butler and I walked on to Butler's, well, he came out to North Central, the coach did, during the summer after my senior year. And I didn't get a scholarship or anything, but he had me be a walk-on player. And so I did that, and I played volleyball in high school. Never was good enough to do that in college or anything. Um, Played oboe in the band, piccolo in the marching band, because you don't do oboe in the marching band. So I
Do you
had a
still play
variety.
tennis? Do you still play the oboe?
I don't play the oboe. I rarely play tennis. I am very into beach volleyball. So I play twos beach volleyball.
Here in Indianapolis? I know
Yeah.
there's some courts. I've seen some on the south side.
Yeah, actually, the two new courts indoor just opened this year. So I've been even able to play in the winter. There's one in Greenfield out by the Mount Comfort exit. And then there's one, I think, in Westfield. And so they're having leagues and things like that. So you can play sand volleyball in the winter in Indiana. It's amazing. It's amazing.
Are there like leagues and everything? Anyone can go watch, or you just sign up and play, or how organized is it? Because, I have to confess, sand volleyball isn't something I associate with Mount Comfort exit.
I know. It's very organized. They have, right now I'm playing in a Cali style league on Wednesday nights, and you basically, you have a partner and you just go and you just play per point, and like they'll have a winner. It's like an 8-week session, and then they'll have the tournament. But mostly I do doubles, or like the Cali doubles. There's also 4s, 6s. The 6s, we always joke, are literally people can stand on the court and drink beer while they play. Like they're not exactly
moving.
Yeah, they're not really moving.
Well, let's merge something. It's a little bit premature in the interview because I wanted to ask you about this later, but since you just mentioned it, one of the things that I miss most about Indianapolis and the culture and the events, this is way pre-COVID, is when we lost the tennis tournament that was here, which was absolutely fabulous. We've talked to Mark Miles about it, who used to be head of the ATP. But did you ever cover that or attend it, or kind of what are your memories of that tennis tournament, the RCA championships, if you have any, and I believe that tournament was voted the favorite tournament of the players like 10, 12 years in a row.
Yeah, I never got to cover that because I just came onto sports about 7 years ago. But I was an intern at AUL, which is now One America downtown, and they were a huge sponsor of the tournament. And so one whole summer, I spent my entire summer like getting our sponsorship. Like we put on the big gala the night before. And so I got to be super involved in it one year. And it was, I mean, literally, yeah, like, it was the coolest event. I mean, it was just crazy. And it was so just magical. And I don't even know what happened to that. I don't even know.
Cincinnati ate it.
Okay.
The Cincinnati tournament is an ATP 1000 Masters event, and it got to be so huge that it has, men and women. I mean, the top men, the top women, and you just couldn't justify an Indianapolis tournament that close to it. Now, I was in the mayor's office working for Mayor Ballard when the tournament died, and we tried hard to keep it, but Cincinnati is an underappreciated corporate base. They have a lot of money down there, and they bankrolled the tournament, and the tournament's right across the street from Kings Island. And so that's kind of how it went away. You mentioned your love for Pete Sampras. He was here several times. Did you get to meet him?
No, I never got to meet him.
I was in the audience one time when he took questions and some girl shouted out, "Will you marry me?" Was that you, Dana?
Okay, maybe I did get to yell something at him one time. Oh my gosh, I remember my mom hated him, and she would always be like, "Oh, Dana, like why would you like?" I don't know. She thought he was arrogant, and I was like, if you're that good, you can't be that good without a little cocky. You got to be. I think
he was more quiet than anything else, as opposed to Agassi, who was loud and wore a wig.
Oh, yeah, Agassi, I forgot. You're bringing back it, yeah.
Wore stonewashed shorts. Stonewashed jean shorts. Was your first job out of Ball State? Was it at Noblesville, or tell us how you matriculated eventually to the Star?
Yeah, my first job out of Ball State, I worked for the now defunct Noblesville Daily Ledger, and I covered government. And so I would go, pretty much my job was, county, I kind of covered county. So it was county commissioner meetings, council meetings, every night. And then it was before, and it's why I got into journalism. There was no websites. It was 1997. Newspapers didn't have websites. So you would come back from the meeting, you'd sit in a dark newsroom, write the story. And happened to be an afternoon paper, but our deadlines, of course, had to be in by the next morning. So you would write that, and then it would break like in the afternoon. And it was just a thrill, like to pick up the real paper and see your story on the front page. So I did that a year, and then was going kind of head to head against the Star guy who covered Hamilton County government. And his editor, she called me up and she was like, I noticed you're beating our writer like at a lot of stories. And so she said, would I be interested in coming in for an interview? So within a year, I was at the Star covering education. Again, a lot of like night school board meetings. And then I moved on a year later to the business desk, and I stayed there a year and covered Simon Property Group, all the Fortune 500 companies, Finish Line, all the public companies that were in Indy, retail, real estate development. So it was just, lots and lots of not as many meetings, but just a lot of, earnings reports and scouring all of that stuff, which has kind of helped, believe it or not, in some of the stuff I do for sports, just because I do a lot of financial, NCAA, kind of some of the more, I don't know, people would call it boring, but the nitty gritty runnings of sports. Just did Lucas Oil, I got their financial reports during 2020 and ran through how much they lost due to COVID. And so I still use it a little bit. But then once off of the business desk for 10 years, I moved over to fitness, and I tried out all kinds of sports and workouts and wrote about those. And that's kind of how I translated into sports, because Andrew Luck was doing something, and it was his year after his rookie season, I believe. And some fitness company asked if I would be willing to interview him about some product. And so I got a one-on-one sit down with Andrew Luck, and it was like an hour in the Colts press room, just me and him. And from there, I just kind of moved over to the sports desk, and I love it. Like, I wouldn't trade it. I wouldn't move for anything.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is Dana Hunsinger Benbow, sports writer for the Indianapolis Star. I guess I got to ask the question, how the hell did you beat out John Toohey to be this fitness writer for the Indianapolis Star?
He cusses too much. Have you heard his mouth?
You think I haven't been interviewed by him? Is his nickname still John Effin Toohey?
Yes. He would be cussing. Like, they did videos of me working out. It would be X-rated videos if he had to try to work out. Oh my gosh, he's amazing.
He's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
So fun to work with, if you can understand him. Like, John, turn up the volume on your phone. It's all the way up. Okay.
Oh, that's great.
Do you look back at the days of some of the beats you've had, and quite frankly, they're just gone? It has to be somewhat wistful for you to look back and go, God, I mean, at one time the Star had a fitness writer, or multiple people working in the business section. Is that just kind of tough?
Oh my gosh, it is so hard. I remember when I first got there, we had, I think, 250 people in the newsroom, and I'm not sure what the number is now, but I know it's in the dozens. And like on the business desk, there were 12 business writers, and yeah, we don't have fitness. It's so sad, but it's just, it's just one of those things that and that's the thing. I worry about the industry every single day. I worry about, will people still want to get their news this way? Or because a lot of people get it from, Facebook, because we can do metrics, and people are just listening to other people tell their own news on Facebook, and companies are coming up with telling their own stories. Like IU Health, they have a whole team that I actually wrote for a year that basically tells the story of their hospitals and Riley. and they get so much traction from people reading those. So granted, they're not necessarily unbiased because it's written by the company, but sometimes people really don't sadly care about that. So just the 24-hour news cycle, the social media, it's just changed everything. And like I said, I didn't get into journalism to break news on Twitter. Like I wouldn't have even thought of that. So it's very, very sad for me.
Is that the love-hate relationship that so many journalists, in particular sports journalists, have with Twitter? What do you like about it, and what do you loathe about it?
I like Twitter. It's definitely, I think, a place where most people, break their news or get their news. And I like that that you can do that, and it tends to do, pretty well and reach a lot of people. However, I mean, it's, you know how it is. There's never, you can post anything. Like I followed Chase and Sadie Smith for a year. They were elite athletes. Chase was an elite swimmer. Sadie's at IUPUI right now, diving Division I, doing wonderful. And, he had terminal cancer. They got married as high school sweethearts. And there was nothing not to think was sweet about the story, really. And even with that, I got hate mail, and people will find any reason to, come back at you. And I don't know what it is about that.
Okay. So what is it? Let's ask about that just a little bit. What did they find so terrible about it? Just that you were devoting so much time to it? Like, why this guy and why not my son, or why not other people, or why not other stories? Cover the Colts.
Yeah. Yeah. Like more why you're just inundating us with this story of these two people. And I'm sick of hearing about it, and I'm sick of it. And they were very Christian couple, and there was no way to tell their story without including that. It would not have been an authentic story unless their faith was included in it, because every time you talk to him, that's what they talked about. And that was how he dealt with his terminal illness. And he died in April of 2021, but even up until the very end, I mean, and so people were very negative about, mentioning his faith. But if you hadn't mentioned his faith, then there would have been a whole other side of people who knew him, who said that you were, withholding his faith. And I feel like I just feel like it's a very vindictive platform. I don't get that with Facebook or Instagram or any of that. I don't know anything about Snapchat other than my teenage sons have it, so I don't use that. But I just feel like, do you feel that way? Like Twitter is kind of a mean-spirited platform?
Well, I finally deleted my Facebook account about 2 months ago, just because it wasn't working for me, and for various reasons. And I don't miss it like at all. Like, not at all. Twitter is a little different because, as has been documented on the podcast, my favorite football team is the Miami Dolphins. They've been my favorite football team since Super Bowl VI, 1972.
But why?
Why are they my favorite team?
Yeah. If you grew up in Indiana, why?
Well, when I was born in 1967, so we didn't have a team till 1984. Right. So the Dolphins in the early 1970s were winning Super Bowls and going undefeated. And so, like so many people who are still Bears fans in this market, despite the Colts, I just stuck with them as a kid. And then we draft Dan Marino, and you think, hell, you're going to keep winning. And that hasn't worked out. So, there's something to be said for loyalty. But
yeah.
I'm on Twitter, a lot of it because I follow sports writers, for my team, and a lot of history accounts. So I find Twitter, it's easier because you don't see all the comments immediately like you do on Facebook. Twitter, it's easier for me to ignore that or just not engage. But as a reporter, and I'm lousy with social media as a PR professional, which I guess I kind of am, I'm lousy with social media. And if Chris Spangle could, well, I guess he could interject with a hearty laugh. right now if he wanted to. He would second that. But as a journalist, do you have to have a Twitter account? Like, does the editor or does Ms. Green or someone say, "Look, I know you hate it, but you got to have one," or can you just chuck it and go, "I'm not putting myself through this"?
We don't have like a mandate. However, it would be probably not very smart not to have a Twitter account, just due to the fact that, that's where people are getting their news. And if you don't post your stories on Twitter, not very many people are going, I mean, people are, but they're not going, "Hey, indiestar.com, let me pull up that website and see what stories there." You know what I mean? They're coming
Right.
to the website because someone posted a story. So yeah, I mean, I think the best bet, and I am not good at social media either. I don't respond to anything negative ever. And I definitely don't talk negative on Twitter, but I also don't do a good job of engaging enough. So I'm pretty bad at it too. I pretty much like post stories there and then just hope they take off. So, like
Now,
the Greg Doyles of the world, he is in there. I mean, he is talking nonstop, and that's why he has 100,000 followers probably.
I
So
was going to ask you about that. I see Greg at the gym from time to time down in Southport when I'm playing racquetball. He's usually in there boxing around somewhat. It's always
yeah,
fun to. We usually have a kind of perfunctory 2 or 3 minute conversation with I when I see him. He's very engaging, obviously. Uh, do you ever compare social media horror stories because what he does is opinion driven,
yeah,
so he automatically is going to elicit responses pro or con based on what he writes.
yeah. And that's the beauty that I have. Like, I don't write opinions. So if anyone does rip, I can say, well, that is what that person said, or that, it's
Mhm.
factual based. Not any of my opinion is inserted. And with him, I mean, that's all it is. And so, yeah, I don't know how he does it. I know when he goes on vacation, sometimes he literally doesn't check Twitter for 6 days. He just stays completely off of it just to take a break. But all of us in the newsroom, I mean, we talk a lot about, the reaction you get on Twitter. And I'm trying to think if I have any terrible horror stories. I don't, well, I mean, I have a certain person right now who is going at me on Twitter, but that's
If
nothing new.
Do you feel like they're like stalkerish, or is it just they're just unhinged? Because I have to admit, I couldn't tell you the number of times either on Facebook or Twitter I have started to write a reply or a response and just deleted it and go, why am I
Right.
doing this? Like, why? It doesn't matter. Like, I don't care. They don't care about me. I don't care about them. I disagree with
Right.
them. That's fine. Move on to the next thing. That's actually one of the reasons why I got off Facebook is you tend to try to engage and then you realize that it's just meaningless. It's like
Yep.
winning an air guitar contest and calling yourself Jimi Hendrix.
Right. And I do notice some of the meanest comments if you click on a person's profile. Either it's a fake account because there's maybe 7 followers, or it is. So I sometimes wonder if people just create accounts just to do, just to kind of do that. And then that
Sure.
leads me to the question, why would I care if they're that desperate that they have to create a fake account to make their life entertaining? Then why do you even care what they're saying? So I try to just stay away from the negative and focus on the positive.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest is Dana Hunsinger Benbow. She is a writer for the Indianapolis Star. She is also married, has 3 teenage sons. That's a lot to juggle. And she has her own pet goat named Gus. Is Gus is Gus on Twitter?
He has an Instagram page, Gus the Glorious Goat. So you should follow him, although he only posts about once a month, if that. But he was recently, Patty Spitler had him and I come downtown. This is hilarious. She had him come down for Pet Pals TV, but I was going on the morning of the Monumental Marathon. So it was like, I left really early because I didn't want to be late for live TV. And so I was early. So I went to a gas station, like to pump up my tires, and there's a goat in my back seat. And I went to the gas, and this guy like was in the, like at the gas tank next to me. And he goes, okay. He goes, hang on. He said, I am tripping on LSD. He said, but please tell me that I am not like seeing things like that. Really is a goat in the back of your car. And I was like, yes, it really is a goat. And so, yeah, I got Gus in October of 2020. His mother had died. I don't live on a farm. I do live on 2 acres. But his mother had died. And so he was 6 days old. And so the person was like, he'd need to be bottle fed. And so I bottle fed a goat inside my house until now he doesn't come in the house. He absolutely can't, because they let loose. Like you can't potty train them, so
Sure.
They have to stay out. But he's as much of a dog as a goat could be. He lives in the backyard with the golden retriever. I don't think he knows he's a goat because he's never been around a goat. So he thinks he's a dog. He eats meat, which is, goats don't usually eat meat, but he eats pepperoni pizza he is like the best goat in the whole entire world. And I wrote a children's book that has not yet been sent out, but it's ready. So I'm hoping to get a book published about him.
What's the name of that Instagram account again?
It's Gus the Glorious Goat.
We are talking to Dana Hunsinger Benbow for the Indianapolis Star. She's an award-winning.
And that's the name of my children's book.
All I can think of at the moment is the Andy Griffith Show episode where the goat eats the dynamite. Have you seen that?
Yes. I love Andy Griffith. Or the Green Acres. I think they had a wild goat on there too, but we're really aging ourselves.
That's true. I have to admit, I probably watch 10 to 15 episodes of the Andy Griffith Show a month, at least.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to say in your life, and I was going to say, then don't talk to me, because I've seen every one probably 10 times each.
My favorite episode is called The Shoplifters.
Which one's that?
It's where the old lady is doing the shoplifting in Weaver's store, and Barney catches her, but then she pulls out the Bible. Have you not seen that one? It's called The Shoplifters.
Yes. Or my favorite is Citizen's Arrest, when somebody starts making a citizen arrest on Barney or something
Gomer.
in the truck. Yeah.
Gomer does for the U-turn, and then they
Yeah.
And Barney calls Gomer a boob, which I thought was pretty racy for the early 60s.
It was.
Did you I'd be absolutely terrible podcast host if I didn't immediately say, did you ever get to talk to Jim Neighbors and tell him of your love for the Andy Griffith Show when he was here for the 500?
I did get to talk to Jim Neighbors, and I told him my love of Gomer Pyle, because that was also my that was what I grew up. I just loved Sergeant Carter, Gomer Pyle. I loved that show. So I didn't mention Andy Griffith, but I did tell him Gomer Pyle. And I think that was the year before. I think it was the year before it was his last year to sing. So, and I think Florence Henderson was with him at the time. When I talked, I think I got to talk to 2 greats at the same time.
You mentioned playing team sports, for example. Does that prepare you, like volleyball or a sport like that? Does that prepare you, you think, for an office environment, like a newsroom, where everyone has to, you have editors and you have fellow writers and photographers, and you all have to work together? Does one helpful the other?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Because, I mean, personally, people see the writer's byline, but they have no idea the layers of work that goes into a story, from copy. I mean, you do, because you're in the industry, but we have copy editors, we have design studios, we have an editor. Like if it's a controversial story, 3 or 4 editors might go through that. There's stories where you work with another reporter on and I've always liked working alone, but being on a team, playing volleyball, you kind of learn to give and take, and it's not all about you, and whose byline goes first. It makes you want to put the other person's byline first because you're trying to be a team player. And so yeah, I think for sure, I think sports is pretty much good for any career. And I know if Chris doesn't really like sports or isn't a big into it, I mean, but I do think that it does have lessons, and it does have far-reaching implications beyond the court and field, because you look at like just the cultural things that sports has done over the years, with Jackie Robinson, and the NCAA tournament, started saying that it wouldn't have host cities unless they allowed, same-sex marriage, or, that kind of thing. And I feel like it kind of has paved the way for so much more than what just happens with the athletes on the field.
Is that always a part of your mindset in your writing when you cover a big event that crosses the lines with social issues that, for example, Major League Baseball this year took the All-Star game out of Atlanta in protest of what they perceived to be restrict voting laws. And then a few months later, the Atlanta Braves host the World Series.
Right.
Didn't they win it? So, there's a lot of cheerleading and applauding for Major League Baseball when they took that stance. And then there was a lot of kind of guffawing and laughter from the other side when the Braves hosted the World Series, an even bigger event than the All-Star game. So is it tough for you to, because you're not an opinion writer, to straddle a line without alienating a certain group of people, or is that just inherent in the gig?
It is very difficult to straddle the line, but not so much as a non-opinion writer, because of course the demand from editors is always to call both sides. So in a very controversial story, you definitely always try to get both sides. I think I was thinking about, for example, the kneeling at the the NFL kneeling during the anthem games, and it is a different world for sports, because I do feel like, unlike years past, maybe 2 decades ago, even the average reader is bringing politics into sports. And so if you write something, they will call you, either left leaning or right leaning, whichever they feel is the case. And you're literally writing a sports story. So even though you have the Jackie Robinsons and all the, Billie Jean Kings and all these people paving the way for social justice and social issues, I feel like it's really culminating right now, because these athletes now have their own, platform. Like LeBron James can go on Twitter and say whatever he likes. And so it's completely changed the landscape of reporting sports.
And the reader expects you to take a side. So if you're writing about kneeling about the national anthem or during the national anthem, even though you are a straight news reporter, they're like, well, why didn't you condemn it? Or, why didn't you applaud it? And you're not helpless in response, but you're almost like, you can't just spend all day saying, well, that's not my job. Go see Greg Doyle.
Right. And I think, and that's the case where you're also like, even if I could take a position, I wouldn't, because I just would not even open up that can of worms. I mean, I like very much not being a columnist. I can't imagine the heartache and turmoil of writing something every day, that's controversial enough that you're really, really getting it from people. James Briggs, he might even have it worse than Greg Doyle, because I know people just are relentless.
Well,
but we also, I want to say, we also love those people. I don't want to, because I love that readers are engaged enough, obviously, that they care what people are writing at the Indianapolis Star. So it's not in any way like we don't, I'm not trying to rip on them. I'm just saying it can be tough when you're sitting in the seat of the journalist.
Dana, you mentioned that sports has been something you've been interested in your entire life. What is the earliest or first sporting event you remember?
Ooh, Ooh, that's a good question because we did not go. The earliest sporting event is watching my dad play basketball in leagues. Like when it was in the era of the Cabbage Patch Kids because I remember taking my doll to the game. So I remember watching my dad play basketball and softball, but as far as going to an actual sporting event, it was probably early Colts years. I mean, I was in college at Butler and I can remember taking my textbooks to the game. They were that bad. Like I would sit in the stands. We had season tickets, but I would literally study while they played. And then I do remember my first concert though, veering off. It was Michael Jackson's Bad concert at Market Square Arena.
Well, remember that
What
answer.
was your first?
My first concert was Van Halen in El Paso, Texas. I was stationed in the Army right outside in White Sands Missile Range, about 50 miles away. So that was the first concert that I got to choose. First concert I remember as a kid, Starlight Musicals, Johnny Mathis.
Oh.
Yes, and he wore a burgundy velvet burgundy tuxedo that looked like the back seat of a 74 Eldorado. I'm going to ask you that. I'm going to ask you as one of the 5 questions is what was your first concert? So I'm going to have to think up another one here before I actually ask them to you.
I'm sorry.
No, not at all. Is there a sporting event or game in history you wished you would have covered?
Can it be like even before? I would love to have covered Lou Gehrig's speech about being the luckiest man on the earth. I would have loved to have been there for that because I was, obviously grew up a huge Yankees fan and I loved that. I also loved, do you remember Brian's song, the movie about Piccolo? Yeah, that was one of my very favorite movies growing up. And that kind of era of, college and pro football where some of those friendships were formed. And I don't know, kind of any historical, I don't have one, but definitely Lou Gehrig's speech. And I did get luckily to cover a lot with Carl Erskine and his friendship with Jumpin' Johnny Wilson and Anderson, which was completely like unheard of. They were school boys. Erskine's white, Jumpin' Johnny Wilson's black, and they were best friends. And they did everything together and they played in the wigwam basketball together. And then of course, Erskine went on and had played with was it the LA Dodgers?
I think he maybe started with Brooklyn and ended up in LA, maybe.
Yeah. And so he continued that with, that just color. I mean, you don't want to say colorblind, but I mean, he always, when I sat down with him, he was just like, I literally just didn't see anything other than myself when I looked at Jumpin' Johnny Wilson. He was a kid who liked basketball. And so I love those kind of historical racial sports stories and how they kind of bring people together.
Unless it's changed, and maybe it has because it's been so long, but in psychology classes for years, it was the movie Brian's Song that was shown in class because it was the only movie that would make men cry.
Oh, are you serious?
It was the movie they showed in class, in college classes and universities to induce men to tears.
That is fabulous.
And if you get on YouTube and watch the NFL special on Butkus and Sayers, A Football Life, there's a segment in there that actually features Billy D. Williams and the real Gale talking about that movie. You should look it up. Really cool.
Yep, I'm going to look that up. And I was just thinking
Plus, there's 10 minutes of highlights of Dick Butkus just absolutely putting people in comas, which is always great. You were getting ready to say something, Dana. Go ahead.
No, I was just thinking the other day, I need to pull that movie out again and watch it. Make my boys watch it,
It's so incredibly sad.
Yeah, it is so incredibly sad. And I just remember just crying and thinking if maybe this is what a sports hero is, because growing up, you think the sports heroes are the people that are, dunking the ball or hitting grand slams. And then that was the first time I actually thought, I think sports heroes are something completely different than what they do on the field. And so it was like, really, it was a super impactful. And I just remember renting it at the Greenfield Public Library on VHS. And I had no idea what I was getting into, but it's a great movie.
Mentioned a few minutes ago when the podcast started that Hoosiers seemingly have an insatiable appetite for nostalgia. Does that help you? A, do you agree with that statement? B, if you do, does that help you as a reporter? Because there's so many stories you can pull back, you can talk to. You did that terrific story about Art Schlichter and his gambling addiction, which is just as a human being, with a heart, you find just so gut wrenching that this guy struggles. Just a few weeks ago, or maybe a few months ago, you wrote that story about Ted Kitchell, who I actually know a little bit, only because my ex-wife used to be his kid's babysitter.
Oh my gosh!
And Ted Kitchell's an incredibly nice man. And so when you go back and you talk to someone and you bring those stories back, Landon Turner, the list goes on and on. Does the fact that Hoosiers just seem to always want to revel in the past and the good old days, is that helpful to you? Give you more story ideas?
Oh, absolutely. There's just, because obviously in these days you can metric, you can look at what people are reading. And besides Wentz being put on reserve COVID just now, which is going crazy. Those kind of stories do remarkably well. One of my best read stories of 2021 was the college. He was married, had 2 children, and he just recently died this year. And I got to talk to him months before he died. But Steve Platt, who was the highest, he still holds the record for most points scored in college in Indiana. But he was a 26-year-old husband and father and farmer when he did it. So he would literally work on the farm all day, go, to basketball practice, and then, come home and take care of his wife and kids. And so he was a grown man basically when he set the record. And I remember asking him because the 3,000 point record was getting ready to be broken by Mangus. And I was asking him about it. And he said, that's not comparing apples to apples. He has the 3-point line. He gets to play more games than I did. And so he was still holding on to that record. But yeah, any of those historical sports stories are just, I just finished one today that we'll be running on Tony Holman Jr., who I had no idea, this standout athlete. Did you know that? He was on Yale football's undefeated team in 1923 as a left end. He was named an All-American end. In high school, he was the number 1 pole vaulter and high hurdler in the nation. He was named by the high school association. And you hear about him as a racing legend and Clabber Girl and buying up all the business ventures, but I had no idea that he was an athlete in his own right. And so I went through I called Yale and got through their archives, which no one had very much because it was 1920. There just wasn't a lot, but I did find enough to write a story. So hopefully people will enjoy that.
I mentioned Matt Tully earlier, and I haven't had too many run-ins with journalists, but I've had maybe a few. How do you handle, and it's funny too, because in a lot of the ones that I've had, the reporter's at least been kind enough, like Matt and I would have all these, lunches or Starbucks or off the record conversations or text exchanges or whatever. But when he needed to talk to me as Matt Tully of the Indianapolis Star, he would call me and say, "Hey, Robert, it's Matt. I need to talk to you on the record." As soon as he said my name, which I always appreciated, because then there's no gray area. And sometimes we would go at it. How do you, as a journalist, you're dealing with a lot of times with extraordinarily wealthy men and women. who have egos, who are very concerned about their public perception and their brand. And I would imagine they can go all Bill Belichick on you from time to time. How do you handle that?
Well, as far as the on the record, like what you just mentioned, I think that's very much a politics business thing. I almost never go off the record with people. It's a very, very rare case just because I've been burned too many times by, and my fault as well. I don't think it's a gray area. What's background, what's on the record, what's off the record. I mean, I think you have to establish that with people if you're going to do that, because I had a ESPN PR person tell me something on background, and what we consider background was not what she considered background. So I try to be really careful with that, especially when you can post news immediately and it's up before, in the blink of an eye, and then someone calls you up and says that was supposed to be whatever off the record, or background meant don't use my name or don't use the company name. So, but as far as egos, I mean, it is unreal how down to earth these people, these athletes are. And I am not just saying that. I mean, I covered business for 10 years, and the ego of the business CEOs I covered, they were a lot of them were much higher and much harder to work with than, talking to an elite athlete. And I don't know why that is. I mean, I haven't obviously talked to LeBron James or Steph Curry or superstars, but Andrew Luck and Peyton Manning. I mean, I was just with Peyton Manning at his bourbon launching, and I mean, they're just very, very nice, like down to earth people. And maybe it's because they make their money doing things with a ball. I mean, it's not like I don't know. Yeah. I've been very lucky.
Indianapolis has had, I think it's fair to say, more than its fair share of really strong sports journalists. Back to when I was growing up, and they were, basically white males, and that's changed considerably. And we've lost a couple of significant journalists just this year, and Bob Jenkins and a former podcast guest, Robin Miller. Are you someone who look back at the years of the Star when it was owned by the Pulliams and had the great Bill Benner and John Banch and Phil Richards and even Bob Kravitz, who I just think the world of, if only because one of our combined favorite movies is Slapshot. So whenever I see him, I say Toe Blake, and he always replies, "Old time hockey." And so the Star in the news in this market, Chet Kopic, I mean, Don Hine, I mean, the list goes on. Anthony Calhoun, we could name them all day and night. But do you look at them and think, wow, they've covered some amazing stories. What can I learn from a guy like that?
Oh my gosh, yes. I call Mark Monteith, Bill Benner, used to call Robin Miller. I eat up anything they can tell me. And I actually search for their stories in our old newspaper archives to see, when I'm writing these kind of stories, what their take was. And like I said, my college professor, Debbie Reed, was a woman sports writer when the Colts came to town. So it's amazing to think that maybe what I'm writing now will someday, some young journalist will look back in the archives, and use it. And they are fabulous. And the knowledge, I mean, when Robin Miller died, I wrote his obituary, and I talked to so many people about him, and I learned so many things about him. But what's most amazing is the knowledge that we've lost, like really as a city, with him being gone, because there is probably no one in Indianapolis who knows more about racing or city, than Robin Miller did. I mean, he just immersed himself in it. And it's kind of a magical thing to come after those people who were so great at what they did. And I mean, they really were. A lot of old newspapers in the day were, you read stuff and you're like, oh, that was typical writing, who, what, when, where, why, or whatever. Those guys were way ahead of their time, because they were putting you know, colorful, adding color to it and making you feel like you were right there with them.
Robin Miller's loss is particular because he was such a Homer Southport kid and
Yeah.
so self-deprecating. Great stories. We interviewed Paul Page for the podcast as well. Same thing. There's this thread, this foundation of Hoosierdom, for lack of a better term, that comes through, I think, in some of their writings. There's no bigger Indiana Homer, whether it's the state or the university, than Bill Benner. He's at the top of the top of the top. And his brother, too. His brother came on the podcast. He was absolutely terrific. But one thing that's changed since you've been in journalism, and we have a few more minutes with Dana Hunsinger Benbow, the sports writer for the Indianapolis Star, is that the presence of female journalists has certainly grown considerably, paved in part by people like Sally Jenkins and Jackie McMullen, who wrote this brilliant book on Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. And ironically, perhaps, that one of the top executives at ESPN is someone named Jill Fredrickson. And I don't know if you've ever heard of her.
I wrote a big piece on her.
I remember. That's why I was just getting this. This leads into the fact that her locker was 2 down from me at Thomas Carr Howe High School.
No way.
Yeah. So Jill and her brother Andy and her sister, Kristen, were all East Siders, all went to Howe. So I've known Jill since she was in elementary school. I'd love to have her on the podcast. I'm sure ESPN wouldn't do it, but so proud of her and everything that she's accomplished. But it has changed. And how do you think the change, the proliferation of female sports journalists has helped journalism and perhaps even helped sports?
I think, well, number one, and I was, when you were saying that, I was thinking of Sage Steele too. She's another hometown girl. Yeah. I think right now I'm the only woman on the Star sports desk. And it's still, and I don't know, it's still, a rarity. When I'm in a press box, most of the print journalists are men. There's very few women writers. Now down on the sidelines, some of the broadcast journalists, I feel like there's a lot more women doing that, even maybe more than men now. But I think it's helped. Number one, even the athletes themselves, if you're covering men, they're very respectful. They act like you know what you're talking about. Even when I started, in business 20 years ago, I felt like I was talked down to about business as if I might not understand it. And it may be because I was 20 something and that they were just simply would have done that to anybody young. But I think it's always better to have more diverse coverage of anything because you get it from every viewpoint and you can look at things in a way that other, maybe a man wouldn't look at, or, that's why it's just great to have so many different people from different backgrounds covering any beat, because that's how you really, tell the whole picture.
One of the themes of the podcast is we talk a little bit about unsung heroes. People don't realize how much X had to do with the success of Y, or how much impact this person had. So I'm going to say the name of someone who I think is an unsung hero of this city, not only the sports world as it involves Indianapolis, but the city itself. And if you would you please react when I say this name?
Yes.
Nancy Leonard.
I knew you would say that. You're so right. Oh my gosh. Yes. And I sat down with her after Slick's death and at a bar in Carmel and said I wanted to tell her story. And it is unreal the impact she had on the Pacers staying here and not leaving for something else when they were in financial turmoil. And just people hear the Slick name, but this, she was the one pulling the strings. She was the one, he ran everything by Nancy, anything that was going to happen, he ran by Nancy. And she was a general manager, and not just in a term like not a secretary who ran around, making sure the events were scheduled or the travel was, I mean, she was sitting in meetings with presidents of, those ABA teams and NBA teams. And she was like making decisions, and they were not backing down. And right now it sounds, it's 2021 and people may not understand just how amazing that was back in the, late 60s and early 70s, to have a woman who was doing that and still so graceful and, loving and motherly, but also, as everyone I talked to said about her, I mean, she could be very feisty. And yes, I love that you brought her up. She's one of my favorite people in the world.
Another interview that I wanted to ask you about very quickly, and we have a couple more minutes before we get to the 5 questions. One of the 5 questions will have to be improvised since Dana's already answered the concert question. You just did a terrific piece on a former guest on this podcast, and that's Jeff Smulyan. Talking to him, realizing his role in creating sports talk radio, it was kind of interesting because he realized, and I haven't listened to that interview in a long time, but he was very proud of the accomplishment of what it meant. But he also, in my estimation, looking at him, this is pre-COVID, we were in the same room there in the Emmis building. He was almost wincing, like, yeah, I know that it can be a problem because people get so hyped up about their sports teams. But what did you learn about Jeff Smulyan when you interviewed him and his impact?
Wow. I covered him. This is in the early 2000s when I was on the business desk. I covered Emmis Communications. So I covered him as the CEO of Emmis, and he was on the board of Finish Line. So he was at their board meetings, and I covered him in that aspect. And then all these years later, I went in as a sports writer and looked at him from that side. And just his, he said that when he came up with the idea of sports talk radio, it was in college. And he just remembers sitting in class thinking, hey, it'd be cool if like there was a radio station that just talked about sports. And then when he brought it to his people at Emmis, they like told him it was the worst idea they'd ever heard. And
I love it.
They voted it down. And then, eventually one of them said, well, we're doing good. I think it was Rick Cummings told him, we're doing well. So listen, we'll let you have this one. We can try it. Well, within 18 months, once they brought Don Imus in, it was taking off. And then then they were in New York, the land of the Mets. And of course it was just everybody there ate it up. And so, I learned that he is one of the most down to earth, almost doesn't even know his own. Either he's a really good actor or he really doesn't get the impact he's had on, radio and sports and just even Indianapolis. So
I was going to make that point too. That he was, to make another East Side Irvington, Howe High School connection, his business partner, Dr. Jim Riggs, his daughter, Dina, was in my class at Howe. So I grew up knowing about Emmis and Keishi and all that sort of stuff, but I had no frame of reference, right? Like all I knew were the stickers that were on her folders, right? I didn't know what any of it meant. And it was through that connection that I got to know Jeff a little bit, and then kind of through politics and government, working for the mayor or the governor or whatever, because Jeff Smulyan is one of those guys, like a Maca Browning, like a Mark Miles, like a Jim Dora Sr. or a Jim Dora Jr., Jim Morris, who says, politics be damned. We want to build this city.
Yeah.
And thank God for people, men and women like him, Bill Mays, Yvonne Shaheen, the list goes on and on, right? Who say, look, okay, this is going to make, Bill Hudnut will probably get reelected because we're going to build a stadium and, with no team, and then the Colts coming. All right. But like, we don't care. Like, that's what I got out of it is how down to earth he is, and how much he cares about the city. And sometimes you just wondered, like, does this happen in other places? Does this happen in Nashville or Chicago or St. Louis? Because it sure does seem like it happens a lot here in Indianapolis. Sports people, business people coming together. Go ahead.
No, there is something special about Indy because I've covered, the Super Bowl being here and then making a bid for, the All-Star game was supposed to be here. I followed them to Chicago last year to see what the All-Star game there was like, so that, how they were preparing to hold it here, although it got moved obviously because of COVID. But I mean, meeting all those people, and everywhere I go, the people that are there, like in Chicago, were like, these people from Indy, these business leaders and these sports leaders, they really don't care about each other's, they don't care. They want the other person to be a success, even if they're running Lucas Oil Stadium and versus Gainbridge Fieldhouse. The people that run both of those want the other, it is, I feel like, just because I've been in it 20 years and covered it from the business and sports side, I think there is something special in Indianapolis about the people that are making, and that's why it's been successful.
If you could choose one word to describe Dan Dockich, which word would you choose?
Oh. Well, he hates me, so I don't even know. I don't know. I don't know.
Just say hater.
Yeah, he does not like me. I would say maybe, yeah, I don't know. I can't think of one, but yeah, he mentions me every day on his show and what a terrible, unethical journalist I am. And that's one on Twitter that I definitely don't respond to, but I can't even think of a word for him.
We have reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Our guest today is Dana Hunsinger Benbow, who is a writer for the Indianapolis Star, and she is single-handedly responsible for bringing the Chick-fil-A to the Gainbridge Fieldhouse.
Yes.
So we love you for that, for sure. First question, what was your first job?
I was a McDonald's cashier. Am I supposed to expand or just answer?
No, that's good enough. And Greenfield?
Okay. Yes. And my uncle was part owner, and so I always had to clean the restrooms, and it was nepotism in reverse. Like, he made me do the bad stuff.
Oh, my uncle lives at the corner, basically, not the corner, but very close to the intersection of 9 and 52. So I've eaten in that Greenfield McDonald's many, many, many times. You've answered the second question, which is what was your first concert? And that was Michael Jackson during the Bad Tour, which is a pretty damn good first concert, by the way.
Yeah.
So let me substitute one. If you could have interviewed any sports figure in history, whom would you choose?
Probably Casey Jones from the Celtics. I loved his quiet demeanor and how successful he was, and I would have loved to have talked to him.
And how sad it was in the way that he retired. The year he retired was the one year the Celtics didn't win the championship in the 60s.
Yeah.
Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
I should have studied these. If it's not Gus the Glorious Goat when it comes out, I would say I love The Fault in Our Stars. I know it's so cliche, but I listened to it the whole way to Florida when I covered Jason Sadie and the John Green. I just think it's got so many life lessons in it.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose? Does not have to be a sporting event.
Okay. Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream.
That's a popular choice, by the way.
Is it? Yeah.
Yes. Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, not named Dan Dockich, 2 hours off the record, just to chat, anyone in the world, whom would you choose living today?
Living today. I want to say Vanilla Ice, but that sounds so cheesy. But I love Vanilla Ice. I would love to sit down with Vanilla Ice.
Barack Obama, Paul McCartney, Queen Elizabeth.
I'm sticking with Vanilla Ice.
Definitely a first. You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest today has been Dana Hunsinger Benbow, a sports writer for the Indianapolis Star, and in my mind, the premier sports journalist in this market. And if you've listened to this podcast, you'll understand why, because people want to talk to her. They want to tell her their stories. Dana, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. It's been amazing. And send this to Vanilla Ice just in case he's listening, and he'll give me 2 hours.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.